Welcome. Tonight, we are exploring the life of Jane Austen, the woman who invented the modern novel, from the manuscript she sold for £10 only to have it locked in a drawer for 13 years, to the wealthy marriage proposal she accepted and withdrew in a single day. This is a story of a quiet observer whose penetrating gaze stripped away the illusions of high society, revealing the deeply human vulnerabilities underneath. Please like, subscribe, or leave a gentle thought below. Now settle in, soften your shoulders, and slow your breathing. Let us begin. December 16th, 1775. Steventon, Hampshire. White snow covers the dirt roads stretching across the countryside. The temperature of the air drops steadily as the sun sinks below the horizon. Thick layers of heavy, wet snow rest entirely still on the bare, dark brown branches of the oak trees surrounding the large brick rectory. Small clumps of snow fall from the branches and hit the frozen ground with soft thuds. Ice forms in jagged, crystallized patterns across the small, square glass panes of the rectory windows. The wind blows through the trees, making a low rushing sound that vibrates against the wooden window frames. Inside the house, thick logs of dry oak burn in the brick fireplace of the main bedroom. The burning wood snaps and makes loud popping sounds. The bright orange and yellow flames provide the main source of light in the dim room, casting tall shadows against the far wall. The smell of burning wood and grey smoke fills the air near the stone hearth. The intense heat from the fire warms the rough wooden floorboards and the smooth plaster walls. Heavy wool curtains hang over the windows, blocking the draughts of cold air from reaching the center of the room. A large wooden four-poster bed sits on the floor. Thick patchwork quilts cover the mattress. Cassandra Austen rests her head on a white linen pillow. She breathes in and out at a slow, steady pace. Her skin feels warm in the heated room. Beside the bed stands her husband, the Reverend George Austen. He wears a heavy wool coat over a white cotton shirt with a stiff collar. He holds a small, heavy bundle wrapped tightly in white cotton blankets. Inside the blankets rests a newborn infant. George looks down at his new daughter. He shifts the physical weight of the child in his arms. The baby moves her small, wrinkled hands against the tight fabric. She opens her eyes and blinks at the bright light coming from the fireplace. George speaks in a quiet voice to his wife. He states that they expected the baby to arrive a full month earlier. He smiles, showing the deep lines around his eyes. He says the child will be a plaything for their older daughter, Cassie, and a future companion for her. They name the baby Jane. This small infant wrapped in cotton will grow up to manipulate paper and ink. She will sit at a small walnut table. She will hold a sharp feather quill in her fingers. She will dip the tip of the quill into a small glass bottle filled with dark black ink. She will press the wet ink onto sheets of parchment, writing out thousands of words. She will write sentences detailing men and women walking through gravel gardens, drinking hot tea from porcelain cups, and speaking to each other while sitting on upholstered chairs. Men working in London, printing houses, will take her handwritten pages. They will place small metal blocks shaped like letters into a wooden frame. They will roll thick, sticky black ink over the raised metal blocks. They will turn a heavy iron crank. A flat wooden board will press large sheets of paper down onto the inked metal. The wet ink will sink into the paper fibers, leaving sharp black lines. Workers will sew the edges of these paper sheets together with thick thread. They will bind the stacks of paper between stiff brown leather covers. People across England will purchase these physical objects. They will hold the books in their hands and read the printed text. When these books appear on the wooden shelves of shops, the title pages will display a specific arrangement of printed black letters. Those letters will spell out the words, "By a lady." Jane will instruct the publishers to omit her legal name from the covers. She will sit quietly in drawing rooms and watch people hold her books and read her words out loud. In the parlours of Hampshire, young women pull thin metal needles through tightly stretched white linen fabric. They push coloured silk threads through the holes in the cloth. They dip small brushes into cups of water and rub the wet bristles against dry cakes of paint. They brush the coloured water onto thick, rough paper. They press their fingers against the flat wooden keys of large pianos, striking metal strings to make loud musical notes. Jane will do all of these physical activities with her hands. She will also take stacks of blank, flat paper and write hundreds of pages to exchange for currency. She will fold her finished pages and mail them to publishers in the city. The publishers will send her heavy gold coins and printed paper banknotes. She will hold this physical money in her hands. The snow continues to fall outside the window of the Steventon Rectory. The white flakes land softly on the stone steps leading up to the heavy wooden front door. In the wooden barn behind the house, horses stand in their stalls. They chew on dry yellow hay. The sound of their hooves thumping against the packed dirt floor travels through the cold night air. Downstairs, the rectory kitchen remains warm. The smell of roasted mutton and boiled root vegetables lingers in the air near the large iron stove. Inside the bedroom, the fire burns down to glowing red coals. The bright light fades into a soft, warm glow. George Austen lowers his arms and places the baby Jane into a small wooden cradle. He pulls a thin wool blanket over her shoulders. He pushes the side of the cradle with his hand. The curved wooden bottom rocks back and forth against the flat floorboards. The wood rubs together, making a low, rhythmic sound. Jane sleeps. Her chest rises and falls steadily beneath the blankets. The air in the room carries the faint, sweet smell of beeswax. A single thick candle burns on a small round table near the bed. The yellow flame illuminates the smooth, polished grain of the table's surface. Hot, melted wax drips slowly down the side of the candle and pools onto a cold brass plate. The physical structure of the house sits under the falling snow. The wind pushes against the exterior brick walls. The wooden beams supporting the ceiling bend slightly, making dull, cracking sounds under the heavy weight of the snow resting on the roof tiles. Soon, the quiet warmth of this single bedroom will give way to the loud noises of the rest of the rectory. Heavy footsteps will sound across the wooden floorboards from dawn until dusk. Loud voices will echo off the plaster walls of the hallways. Jane will grow rapidly and walk out of this quiet nursery, stepping directly into a household filled with older brothers, loud running footsteps, and boarding students occupying every wooden chair at the large dining table. Spring 1779. Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Bright yellow sunlight shines through the thick glass panes of the dining room windows. Dust particles float in the illuminated shafts of air. The temperature inside the room is warm from the heat of the large brick fireplace burning near the center of the wall. Small droplets of condensation form on the inside of the glass window panes. The water drops roll slowly down the glass, leaving clear vertical trails through the fogged surface. Young boys sit on tall wooden chairs, positioned closely together along the edges of a long, rectangular oak table. The boys push their chairs back. The solid wooden legs scrape loudly against the bare oak floorboards. The boys speak loudly to each other over the clinking sounds of iron forks hitting flat ceramic plates. George Austen sits at the head of the table. He cuts thick slices of roasted pork with a sharp steel knife. Clear juices pool on the surface of the large serving platter. The smell of cooked meat, boiled cabbage, and baked yeast bread fills the warm air of the room. George passes the heavy ceramic plates down the length of the table. The thick porcelain retains the heat from the cooked food. The plates pass from hand to hand. Several of the boys sitting at the table are boarding students. George collects physical silver coins from the parents of these students in exchange for providing them with beds and daily meals. The boys sleep in the upstairs bedrooms and eat at the family table. Jane sits on a wooden stool near the end of the table. Her flat leather shoes rest on the floorboards. She's 4 years old. She wears a long cotton dress with a high, stiff collar. She watches the boys chew their food and talk. She lives in a family with exactly 8 children. 6 of these children are boys. 2 of them are girls. Exactly 75% of the Austen children are male. Jane and her older sister, Cassandra, are the 2 daughters. Jane looks at her brothers. She listens to the high volume of their voices. She watches them reach their hands across the table to grab pieces of warm bread from woven wicker baskets. One of the boys, sitting near the center of the table, is Henry. He has bright hair and wears a dark blue wool coat. He speaks rapidly, forming long sentences and waving his hands in the air to emphasize his words. He laughs loudly, throwing his head back and exposing his teeth. Jane watches his mouth move. Decades later, Henry will take thick stacks of handwritten paper from Jane. He will carry these papers to printing shops in London. He will hand them to publishers and collect flat bank notes in return. He will also write a sequence of biographical words about Jane's life, which printers will bind into the front pages of her books. Right now, he is a young boy chewing on a slice of roasted pork. Cassandra sits directly beside Jane. Cassandra is 3 years older than Jane. She wears a matching cotton dress. Her shoulder touches Jane's shoulder as they lean forward to eat. Jane hands a small ceramic cup of water to Cassandra. Cassandra takes the cup. Her fingers brush against Jane's fingers. The skin of their hands feels warm. Throughout their lives, Jane and Cassandra will sit next to each other in numerous wooden chairs, carriage seats, and drawing room sofas. They will fold flat sheets of paper, dip quills into ink, and write hundreds of letters to each other. They will sleep in the same bedroom, pulling heavy woven blankets over their chests. The physical proximity they share at this dining table will remain a constant element of their daily routine for the next 4 decades. The loud voices of the boys bounce off the hard plaster walls of the dining room. Heavy footsteps thud against the ceiling boards directly above the table as servants walk across the upstairs bedrooms. A maid carries a large metal bucket filled with hot water up the wooden staircase. The water sloshes over the rim of the bucket and hits the wooden steps with wet splashing sounds. In the kitchen down the hallway, an iron kettle whistles loudly over an open fire. Steam rises from the metal spout and hits the stone chimney. The moisture settles on the rough stone, darkening the grey surface. Outside the dining room window, a dirt path leads away from the front door. The damp soil smells of wet grass and earth. Horses walk along the path, pulling wooden carts loaded with logs. The iron rims of the cart wheels grind against small rocks in the dirt, making a low, crunching noise. The wind blows through the green leaves of the oak trees. The temperature outside remains cool. A farm dog barks near the wooden fence. Inside the dining room, the heat from the hearth and the body heat of the 15 people sitting close together raises the ambient temperature of the air. Jane cuts a piece of boiled carrot with the edge of her metal spoon. She places the soft vegetable into her mouth and chews. She keeps her eyes on the people around her. She observes how the boys interrupt each other when they speak. She watches a boarding student spill a drop of brown gravy onto his white linen shirt. She watches him quickly wipe the fabric with a cloth napkin, leaving a faint yellow stain on the threads. She notes the exact movements of his hands and the sudden shift in his posture. She listens to the specific intonations of their voices when they argue about the weather or the horses. The daily routine of the rectory consists of these loud meals, the scraping of chairs, and the continuous movement of bodies through the narrow hallways. Jane and Cassandra will soon pack their cotton dresses and wool stockings into a large leather trunk. The two girls will climb into a wooden carriage drawn by horses. The horses will pull the carriage over the dirt roads, carrying the sisters toward the city of Oxford. They will sleep in unfamiliar beds, breathe the thick smoke of city air, and encounter a microscopic bacterium that will cause Jane's body temperature to rise to a dangerous level. Autumn 1783, Southampton. Thick grey smoke rises from hundreds of brick chimneys and settles over the narrow cobblestone streets of the port city. The dense air smells of burning sea coal, raw sewage, and salted fish resting in wooden barrels near the docks. Wooden carts rattle loudly over the wet stones. The sound of shouting dock workers and the ringing of iron blacksmith hammers echo against the damp brick walls of the buildings. Inside a rented house on a narrow street, the air feels heavy and warm. A small pile of coal burns in an iron wall grate, emitting a sharp, sulphuric odor. 7-year-old Jane lies entirely still on a narrow wooden bed. Thick sweat coats her forehead, her neck, and her arms. Her skin radiates intense physical heat. She breathes in short, rapid gasps. The white cotton sheets beneath her body are soaked with clear perspiration. Small, dark red spots cover the skin of her chest and stomach. Across the small room, her older sister, Cassandra, lies on a second wooden cot. Cassandra also breathes rapidly. Her face flushes a deep red color. Microscopic typhus bacteria circulate and multiply in the bloodstreams of both girls. The bacteria attack the endothelial cells lining their blood vessels. Their teacher, Mrs. Anne Coley, sits on a wooden stool near the single glass window. She watches the girls breathe. Jane's aunt, Jane Cooper, stands beside the bed. Mrs. Cooper dips a rectangular piece of linen into a ceramic bowl filled with cold water. She twists the fabric with both hands, wringing the excess water from the cloth. Heavy drops of water splash onto the bare oak floorboards. She places the wet linen directly across Jane's hot forehead. The cold water absorbs the heat from Jane's skin. The wet linen grows warm within minutes. Mrs. Cooper removes the cloth, dips it back into the bowl, and repeats the process. Mrs. Cooper walks to a small wooden writing desk in the corner of the room. She takes a feather quill, dips it into a bottle of black ink, and writes a sequence of words onto a folded sheet of thick paper. She melts a stick of red wax over a candle flame. She lets the hot wax drip onto the fold of the paper and presses a metal seal into the puddle. She hands the paper to a hired messenger standing in the doorway. Days pass. The high body temperatures persist. Heavy wooden carriage wheels grind against the cobblestones outside the window. The heavy oak door of the bedroom opens. Jane's mother, Cassandra Austen, walks into the small room. She wears a thick traveling cloak. The wool fabric smells of wet horsehair and damp road dust. She steps immediately to the side of the bed. She touches her cool fingertips to Jane's hot cheek. Mrs. Austen sits on a hard wooden chair beside the bed for consecutive days and nights. She pours warm chicken broth from a metal pot into a small tin cup. She tilts the rim of the cup against Jane's dry lips. The salty yellow liquid flows into Jane's mouth. Jane swallows the broth. The coal fire in the grate hisses and pops as the embers shift and fall through the iron bars. Eventually, the intense heat leaves Jane's skin. The temperature of her body drops to a standard level. The red spots fade completely from her chest and arms. Her breathing slows to a deep, steady rhythm. She opens her eyes and looks up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. Her white blood cells destroy the bacteria. Her damaged tissues repair themselves. Both sisters regain their physical strength over the following weeks. They sit up in their beds, consume solid food, and walk across the floorboards of the rented house. By the spring of 1785, the girls pack their cotton dresses and wool stockings into large leather trunks. Two men lift the heavy trunks and strap them to the back of a horse-drawn carriage. The sisters climb inside the wooden cabin. The driver whips the horses. The carriage pulls them away from the salty air of Southampton. The horses walk for many miles over dirt and gravel roads. They travel to the inland town of Reading. The carriage halts in front of the Abbey House School. The massive building features tall stone walls, large glass windows, and a steep slate roof. Jane and Cassandra walk through the heavy front doors. Inside, they sit at wooden desks arranged in straight rows. For several months, they practice specific physical tasks in the busy classrooms. Jane holds a thin steel needle between her thumb and index finger. She pushes the sharp point through taut white linen fabric, pulling brightly colored silk threads through the holes to form precise, symmetrical stitches. She holds a piece of white chalk and presses it against a flat slate board. She drags the chalk across the dark surface to form letters and spell words. The chalk makes a dry, scratching noise. She opens leather-bound books and reads the printed text. She moves her mouth and tongue to speak French words aloud to her instructors. She sits on a wooden stool and pushes her fingers against the flat ivory keys of a pianoforte. The internal wooden hammers strike metal strings, producing loud, ringing notes that fill the room. She memorizes historical dates and geographic locations, repeating the facts out loud along with the other students. In 1786, their time at the school ends. The sisters pack their leather trunks a final time. The carriage carries them along the dirt roads, returning them to the rural landscape of Steventon. They walk through the heavy front door of the rectory. They step onto the scuffed oak floorboards of the hallway. They walk directly into their father's study. Hundreds of thick, leather-bound books line the tall wooden shelves covering the walls. The air in the room smells of dry paper, old leather binding glue, and pipe tobacco. Jane reaches her hand out and pulls a heavy volume from the shelf. She opens the cover and looks at the closely printed words on the textured paper. She places the book back on the shelf. She walks out the back door of the house. She walks across the damp green grass toward the large wooden barn standing near the edge of the property. Inside the barn, her brothers stand on the packed dirt floor. They hold rolled sheets of paper in their hands. They speak in loud, projected voices, reciting lines of dialogue from comedic plays. The bright light from tall wax candles illuminates the interior of the barn, casting sharp shadows against the rough wooden walls. Jane steps into the candlelight to join them. Late winter, 1787, Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Cold air moves through the wide cracks between the rough wooden planks of the rectory barn. The temperature inside the large wooden structure remains low, matching the freezing air over the frozen dirt fields outside. The smell of dry yellow hay, old wood, and cold horse manure fills the enclosed space. Thick iron hinges hold the heavy wooden barn doors shut against the wind. Inside the barn, 10 tall wax candles burn inside tin lanterns. The yellow flames flicker as the cold draughts hit the hot wicks. The burning tallow wax produces a thick, oily smoke that rises toward the high ceiling beams. The melted wax drips down the sides of the thick candles and hardens in wide pools at the base of the lanterns. The concentrated light from the lanterns illuminates a cleared section of the packed dirt floor. James and Henry Austen walk across this illuminated patch of dirt. They wear heavy wool coats draped over their standard daily clothes. They hold large wooden walking sticks in their hands. They strike the bottom ends of the sticks against the hard dirt floor, creating dull, rhythmic thuds. They speak loudly, projecting their voices toward the shadowed corners of the barn. They widen their eyes, lift their eyebrows, and wave their arms in the air. They recite lines of dialogue from a printed comedy script. They exaggerate their physical movements, stomping their heavy leather boots and falling backward onto piles of dry hay. Jane sits on a wooden barrel positioned just outside the ring of candlelight. She rests her hands on the rough wool of her skirt. She watches her brothers move. She observes the exact timing of their physical gestures. She listens to the loud volume of their voices. She watches the muscles in their faces stretch into exaggerated expressions. Her mother, Cassandra Austen, sits on a wooden stool next to Jane. Mrs. Austen holds 2 long steel knitting needles. She slides the smooth metal needles together, pulling a grey wool thread through a row of tight loops. The metal needles produce a steady clicking sound. She stops knitting. She opens her mouth and recites a loud, rapid sequence of rhyming words. The words form an impromptu comedic poem about the cold weather and the mud on the floor. The boys stop reciting their script. They throw their heads back and push loud bursts of air from their lungs, laughing at their mother's spoken words. Jane watches her mother's lips move. She listens to the specific cadence of the syllables. The theatrical rehearsal ends. The boys blow bursts of air from their mouths, extinguishing the candle flames. Thin trails of white smoke rise from the blackened wicks. The group walks out of the barn. They step onto the frozen grass. The frozen blades crunch under the thick leather soles of their shoes. They walk across the yard and push open the heavy oak door of the brick rectory. The air inside the house holds the intense heat generated by the burning logs in the brick fireplaces. The smell of roasted meat and burning wood replaces the smell of the barn. The family members take off their heavy outer coats and hang them on wooden pegs in the hallway. Jane walks down the narrow hallway and turns the brass handle of the door leading to her father's study. The study features 4 flat walls covered entirely by tall oak bookshelves. The wooden shelves hold hundreds of thick books. The air in this room smells of dry rag paper, old leather binding glue, dust, and dried pipe tobacco. George Austen stands on the bare oak floorboards near the center of the room. He wears a dark fabric suit. He reaches his arm up to the 3rd shelf. He grips the spine of a large book with his fingers and pulls the heavy volume down. He hands the book to Jane. The weight of the object presses down heavily against her open palms. The book consists of hundreds of thick paper sheets bound tightly together. Stiff cardboard, wrapped in brown calfskin, forms the front and back covers. A metal tool pressed small gold flakes into the brown leather, forming the shapes of letters on the spine. Jane carries the heavy book to a padded chair near the window. She sits down and rests the book on her lap. She opens the thick front cover. The paper pages feel rough and textured against the skin of her fingertips. She turns the page. The thick paper rustles softly. Black ink covers the white page in straight, horizontal rows. A metal printing press pushed this ink deep into the fibers of the paper. Jane moves her eyes across the black marks. She reads long paragraphs detailing historical events, philosophical arguments, and fictional narratives. Other siblings walk into the study. They pull more books from the oak shelves. They sit in the wooden chairs and on the edge of the floor rug. They open the covers and look at the pages. The room falls completely silent. The only sounds are the deep, rhythmic breathing of the family members and the occasional dry slapping noise of a thick paper page turning over. On the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace, a brass clock ticks. The metal pendulum swings left, then right. The small brass gears rotate slowly inside the glass case, marking the exact passage of time. Jane finishes reading the printed text. She closes the heavy leather cover. She places the volume back onto the flat wooden shelf. She turns and walks out of the library. She climbs the wooden staircase to her 2nd floor bedroom. She walks toward a small wooden writing desk positioned against the wall. She pulls a wooden chair out and sits down. She opens a shallow desk drawer. She reaches inside and retrieves a stack of blank, flat paper. She sets the paper squarely on the wooden surface of the desk. She picks up a thin feather quill. She holds a small steel knife in her right hand and cuts the tip of the feather into a sharp point. She reaches for a small glass bottle filled with dark black ink. She dips the pointed tip of the feather directly into the liquid. The black ink coats the hollow tip. She moves her hand over the blank paper. She presses the wet ink against the dry surface. She moves her fingers, dragging the sharp tip across the paper to form a sequence of letters. She writes out the title of her first original story. She dips the quill into the ink again. She will continue this exact physical process until she fills 3 separate bound notebooks with her own handwritten words. Summer, 1790. Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Direct yellow sunlight shines through the thin glass of the second-story window. The light hits the flat, polished surface of a small wooden writing desk. Dust motes float slowly downward through the warm, illuminated air. The temperature in the room is high. A faint smell of dry pine wood, cotton fabric, and sharp vinegar lingers in the enclosed space. Jane sits on a hard wooden chair, pulled close to the desk. She is 14 years old. She wears a lightweight white cotton gown. Her bare feet rest flat against the wide, unpainted oak floorboards. She holds a long grey goose feather in her right hand. The bottom of the feather is carved into a sharp point. She dips the pointed tip into a small glass inkwell. The ink consists of crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, water, and gum arabic. The dark liquid coats the tip of the quill. The iron sulfate emits a faint metallic scent. Jane presses the wet tip of the quill against a large sheet of rough, woven paper. She moves her wrist. The sharp point drags across the dry paper fibers, creating a soft scratching sound. Black ink flows from the quill and stains the paper. She moves her hand continuously from left to right, leaving a trail of wet, black letters. The wet ink reflects the yellow sunlight. She fills the large sheet of paper with rows of words. She sprinkles fine brown sand from a metal shaker over the wet ink. The sand absorbs the excess liquid. She tilts the paper. The dry sand slides off the page and falls into a small wooden tray. She repeats this physical process for hours, filling dozens of paper sheets with handwritten text. She stacks the finished pages on top of each other. She aligns the edges of the thick paper. She uses a thick steel needle to punch small holes through the left edge of the stack. She pushes a heavy linen thread through the holes, binding the pages together into a single block. She wraps the block in heavy, brown paper boards. She dips her quill into the inkwell again. She writes specific words on the front cover of the bound book. She traces the letters to spell volume the first. She will bind 2 more stacks of paper using the exact same method, labeling them volume the second and volume the third. Inside these physical notebooks, the black ink spells out specific narratives. She writes sentences describing characters stealing carriages, breaking locks, and running away with physical currency. She writes dialogue where young women demand food, refuse to speak, and fall flat onto the floorboards in simulated fainting fits. She writes physical descriptions of characters fighting, pushing each other into wooden chairs, and consuming large quantities of roasted meat. The sun lowers in the sky outside the window. The yellow light shifts to a deep orange color. The temperature inside the room drops. Jane places her quill on the desk. She picks up the bound notebook. She walks out of her bedroom and descends the wooden staircase. Her flat leather shoes tap against the wooden steps. She enters the main parlor on the ground floor. Her older brothers, her parents, and her sister Cassandra sit on upholstered chairs arranged around a brick fireplace. A small fire burns in the grate. The smell of burning oak fills the room. Jane walks to the center of the room. She stands on the woven wool rug. She opens the thick cover of volume the first. She looks down at the black ink on the page. She opens her mouth and vibrates her vocal cords, pushing air from her lungs. She reads the words she wrote loudly. She changes the pitch of her voice to mimic different characters. She reads the sentences describing women falling to the ground and men stealing money. Her brothers lean forward in their chairs. They open their mouths wide. They expel sudden, loud bursts of air from their chests. They slap their flat hands against their wool-covered knees. The slapping noise mixes with the sound of their loud vocalizations. Cassandra tilts her head back and smiles, pulling her lips away from her white teeth. George Austen shakes his head from side to side and produces a deep, rumbling sound from his throat. The rapid, exaggerated actions described in the notebook cause the bodies in the room to physically react with laughter. Jane watches their physical movements. She listens to the volume of their voices. She turns the rough paper page and continues reading the next sequence of words. She observes exactly which sentences cause her family to laugh loudest. She registers the specific arrangement of words that produces the strongest physical reaction in her listeners. The fire burns down to grey ash. The parlor grows dark. Jane closes the heavy notebook. She walks back to her bedroom and places the bound volume inside a wooden desk drawer. She pushes the drawer shut. Over the next 5 years, her physical body will grow taller. The bones in her arms and legs will lengthen. She will stop writing short narratives in these bound notebooks and begin filling larger stacks of loose paper with hundreds of continuous pages. She will pack her white cotton dresses into a leather trunk. She will step into a wooden carriage. Horses will pull the carriage over frozen dirt roads to the assembly rooms in nearby Basingstoke. She will stand under bright crystal chandeliers wearing a silk gown, and she will reach her hand out to grasp the fingers of a young visiting law student named Tom Lefroy. December 1795. Basingstoke, Hampshire. Hundreds of thick wax candles burn inside large brass chandeliers hanging from the high plaster ceiling of the assembly rooms. The yellow flames flicker, casting moving shadows across the painted wooden walls. Drops of hot, melted wax slide down the sides of the white candles and pool in the brass drip catchers. The heat from the burning wicks rises toward the ceiling. The ambient temperature of the large room increases steadily as dozens of people stand close together on the polished oak floorboards. 4 musicians sit on wooden chairs on a raised platform. They hold wooden violins tucked under their chins. They grip long wooden bows strung with white horsehair. They drag the taut horsehair across thin steel strings. The intense physical friction causes the strings to vibrate rapidly. The wooden bodies of the violins amplify these vibrations, pushing loud, high-pitched notes into the air. The sound waves travel across the room and bounce off the hard glass panes of the tall windows. Jane Austen stands near the center of the room. She wears a long dress made of smooth, woven silk. The fabric rustles softly as she shifts her weight from one foot to the other. She raises her right arm. She extends her hand forward. Tom Lefroy stands directly facing her. He wears a dark, tailored wool coat and a stiff white cotton cravat wrapped tightly around his neck. He reaches his hand forward. The skin of his palm presses against the skin of Jane's palm. Their fingers interlock. They move together across the wooden floor. They step their feet in precise, geometric patterns, matching their physical movements to the rhythmic timing of the violin notes. The hard leather soles of their shoes scrape against the polished oak, creating a low, steady shuffling noise under the loud music. They walk forward, step backward, and spin in circles. They release their hands, switch positions with other dancers in the line, and reach out to grasp each other's fingers again. The physical exertion causes their heart rates to increase. Small beads of sweat form on their foreheads. The musicians lift their bows off the steel strings. The loud notes stop. The heavy shuffling of leather shoes comes to a halt. Jane and Tom walk toward the edge of the room. They sit down on two straight-backed wooden chairs positioned flush against the painted wall. The sides of their wooden chairs touch. Tom turns his head and points his face directly toward Jane. He speaks in a low volume. He pushes air through his vocal cords, forming words that only Jane can hear over the background noise of the room. Jane turns her neck to look at his face. She pulls the corners of her lips upward, exposing her white teeth. She speaks back to him. They sit in this exact position for a long period, exchanging sequences of words and maintaining direct eye contact. Across the room, older men and women stand near a long wooden table covered with a white linen cloth. The table holds large glass bowls filled with a mixture of water, sugar, and rum. The older adults hold small glass cups in their hands. They turn their heads. They focus their eyes on Jane and Tom, sitting together on the chairs. These older individuals possess heavy iron lockboxes filled with paper documents. The documents feature signatures and wax seals, transferring the legal ownership of vast dirt fields, brick houses, and heavy gold coins. Jane possesses a very small quantity of silver coins in a cloth purse. Tom Lefroy holds a limited stack of paper banknotes. The older adults observe the physical proximity of the two young people. They speak to each other, pointing their index fingers toward the wooden chairs against the wall. Days later, a cold wind blows across the dirt roads of Hampshire. The bare branches of the oak trees rattle against each other. Outside a large brick house in the nearby village of Ash, men carry heavy leather trunks out the front door. The trunks contain Tom Lefroy's folded wool coats, cotton shirts, and thick legal textbooks. The men lift the heavy leather boxes and place them onto the wooden rack of a carriage. They secure the trunks by tying thick hemp ropes into tight knots. Tom Lefroy walks out of the brick house. He wears a heavy traveling cloak. He climbs the metal steps of the carriage and sits on a padded leather bench inside the wooden cabin. A driver sits on the front board. He pulls a long leather whip backward and swings it forward, striking the thick hide of the horses. The horses lurch forward. They pull the wooden carriage down the road. The iron rims of the tall wooden wheels crush small rocks into the dirt, leaving deep, parallel tracks in the damp soil. The horses walk continuously, putting miles of physical space between Tom Lefroy's body and Jane Austen's body. Tom will travel across the sea to the island of Ireland. Years later, he will stand inside a stone church and sign his name into a paper register next to a woman who holds legal deeds to thousands of acres of land. He will sit on a raised wooden bench in a courthouse, wearing a heavy robe and a curled white wig, listening to legal arguments. Back in the Steventon Rectory, Jane remains in her physical environment. Raindrops fall from grey clouds and hit the exterior glass of the parlour window. The water pools on the wooden sill and drips down onto the wet soil outside. Jane sits at her flat wooden desk. She pulls a stack of rough, blank paper toward her. She holds her sharpened feather quill. She dips the pointed tip into the small glass bottle of dark black ink. She presses the wet quill against the top sheet of paper. She moves her hand to form letters. She writes the names of two specific characters. She writes the name Eleanor. She writes the name Marianne. She pulls another blank sheet from the stack and begins to write out a sequence of letters, constructing a story structured entirely as folded pages of correspondence passing between these two sisters. Autumn 1796. Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Heavy drops of water fall from the grey clouds. The rain hits the thin glass panes of the parlour window. The water droplets merge together and slide down the clear glass in uneven, wavering lines. The water pools on the painted wooden sill and drips down onto the wet soil outside. A cold wind blows through the wet branches of the oak trees. The wet leaves stick to the dark brown bark. Inside the parlour, thick logs burn in the brick fireplace. The orange flames consume the dry wood, producing a loud crackling sound. Heat radiates from the stone hearth, raising the temperature of the air inside the room. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth fills the space. Jane sits on a wooden chair, pulled close to a small desk. She places a stack of flat, blank paper on the wooden surface. The paper is thick, made from pressed linen rags. The surface feels rough and heavily textured under her fingertips. She holds her carved feather quill. She dips the pointed tip into the dark ink inside the small glass bottle. She presses the wet tip against the top sheet of paper. The sharp point drags across the dry paper fibers, creating a soft, continuous scratching sound. She writes a sequence of numbers at the top right corner of the page, marking a specific date. She writes a formal greeting. She structures the ink on the page to perfectly match the physical layout of a mailed letter. She writes long paragraphs describing two sisters. She writes the name Eleanor. She dips the quill and writes sentences detailing Eleanor, sitting perfectly still on upholstered chairs. She describes Eleanor keeping her spine straight, folding her hands tightly together in her lap, and speaking in a low, steady volume. She writes physical descriptions of Eleanor, measuring tea leaves into ceramic pots and calculating numbers on scraps of paper. She dips her quill into the inkwell again. She writes the name Marianne. She describes Marianne walking rapidly across wet grass, tripping over exposed tree roots, and falling directly onto the damp ground. She writes sentences detailing Marianne dropping physical objects onto the floorboards, wiping water from her eyes with her hands, and raising her voice to a high pitch. Jane fills the page with these contrasting physical actions. She reaches the bottom of the paper. She signs a name. She takes another blank sheet and writes a reply from a different location. She describes the characters folding these paper letters, melting red wax over the edges, pressing metal seals into the hot wax, and handing the folded pages to riders on horseback. She creates an entire stack of paper filled entirely with these exchanged messages. The stack grows thicker as the hours pass. The wet ink reflects the light from the window. The liquid sinks into the paper fibers and dries into a dull, matte black. Jane aligns the edges of the rough paper with her hands. The sunlight fades from the window. The room darkens. A maid walks into the parlour, carrying a long wooden taper lit with a yellow flame. She touches the flame to the white wicks of several wax candles sitting in brass holders. The new flames illuminate the room, casting tall, stretched shadows against the plaster walls. The family members walk into the parlour. They sit down in the heavy wooden chairs. Cassandra sits on a small wooden stool near the fire. She holds a piece of linen fabric and a thin steel needle. Jane stands up from her desk. She picks up the thick stack of paper. She walks to the center of the room and stands on the woven wool rug. She holds the top page near the candlelight. She reads the handwritten words out loud. She speaks the words of the letters exactly as she wrote them. She alters the pitch of her voice for the character of Eleanor, speaking slowly and softly. She alters the pitch again for the character of Marianne, speaking rapidly and at a high volume. The family members listen to the vocalizations. Cassandra stops pushing her needle through the fabric. She turns her head and looks directly at Jane. George Austen rests his chin on his right hand. He taps the leather sole of his shoe against the oak floorboards in a steady rhythm. The loud crackle of the fire mixes with the sound of Jane's voice. When she finishes reading a letter, she places the top sheet of paper at the very bottom of the stack. She reads the next letter. She repeats this physical process throughout the autumn months. The rain outside changes to white snow. The snow falls on the dirt roads and freezes into hard ice. Jane sits at her desk every day. She dips her quill. She writes more letters between Eleanor and Marianne. She fills dozens of pages. Finally, she writes the last sequence of words. She places the quill down on the desk. She gathers the entire stack of loose papers. She opens a wooden drawer in her desk. She places the stack inside the drawer. She pushes the drawer shut. The wood slides against wood. The ice outside melts into water. Green shoots push through the wet soil. The leaves on the oak trees grow large and turn a bright green color. The temperature of the air rises. The heat of the summer sun warms the exterior brick walls of the rectory. Jane walks through the gravel paths of the garden, stepping over small stones and pulling weeds from the dirt. She returns to her bedroom. She sits back down on the wooden chair at her desk. It is August of 1797. Jane reaches her hand into the drawer and pulls out a fresh stack of completely blank paper. She places the paper squarely on the desk. She picks up a steel knife and cuts the tip of a new goose feather. She dips the sharp point into the dark liquid inside the glass inkwell. She presses the wet quill against the top sheet of paper. She writes a capital letter F. She writes the letter I. She moves her hand steadily across the page, writing out the title, First Impressions. She begins to fill the first page with a completely new arrangement of characters, houses, and conversations. August 1797. Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Yellow sunlight shines directly through the thin glass panes of the parlor window. The heat of the late summer afternoon warms the plaster walls of the room. A small black fly buzzes near the ceiling, its wings vibrating rapidly. The air smells of dry dust and sweet, overripe apples sitting in a wooden bowl on the side table. Jane sits in a wooden chair with a straight back. She is 21 years old. She wears a lightweight cotton dress. Sweat forms on her forehead and the back of her neck. She holds a carved goose feather. She dips the tip into a glass inkwell. She presses the wet point against a thick, rough sheet of paper. She drags the quill across the paper fibers. The sharp tip makes a steady scratching noise. She forms the final letter of the final word. She lifts the quill from the paper. She sets the feather down on the wooden desk. A massive stack of paper rests on the left side of the desk. Hundreds of loose sheets sit squarely on top of one another. The stack measures several inches thick. Black ink covers the surface of every single page. The pages contain the complete manuscript of First Impressions. The sun sets. The room grows dark. A maid lights thick wax candles in brass holders. The family gathers in the parlour. They sit on the upholstered chairs. The fire burns in the stone hearth, popping loudly. Jane stands on the woven wool rug. She holds the thick stack of paper in her hands. The physical weight of the paper presses into her palms. She reads the final pages out loud. She pushes air through her vocal cords, changing the volume and pitch of her voice. She speaks the dialogue of characters walking through large dirt estates and characters arguing in drawing rooms. Her family listens. Her brother James opens his mouth and laughs. Cassandra smiles, exposing her white teeth. George Austen nods his head up and down. 3 months pass. November 1797 arrives. The temperature of the air drops rapidly. White frost forms on the blades of grass in the rectory garden. Cold wind blows through the bare branches of the oak trees. George Austen sits at his wooden desk in his library. He pulls a fresh, blank sheet of paper from a drawer. He dips his metal-nibbed pen into a bottle of dark ink. He presses the pen to the paper. He writes a sequence of words directed to Thomas Cadell. Thomas Cadell operates a large publishing business in the City of London. George Austen writes the physical dimensions of Jane's manuscript on the paper. He writes that the manuscript consists of 3 volumes. He asks if Thomas Cadell will pay physical currency to print the pages and bind them into books. George Austen folds the paper into a small square. He lights a candle. He holds a stick of red wax over the flame. The heat melts the wax. Drops of hot red liquid fall onto the fold of the paper. He presses a brass seal into the puddle of wax. The wax cools and hardens into a solid, flat disc, sealing the paper shut. He hands the sealed paper to a mail carrier. The man places the paper inside a heavy leather saddlebag. The man rides a horse down the dirt roads of Hampshire. He hands the leather bag to the driver of a large mail carriage. The carriage driver whips the horses. The carriage travels over dirt roads, gravel paths, and eventually onto the wet cobblestone streets of London. The metal horseshoes strike the hard stones, creating sharp, clacking noises. The air in London smells of burning sea coal, raw sewage, and damp wool. A delivery man walks into Thomas Cadell's shop on the Strand. The shop smells of wet printer's ink, animal hide, binding glue, and dry paper dust. The delivery man places the sealed letter onto a flat wooden counter. Thomas Cadell stands behind the counter. He wears a dark wool suit. He picks up the letter. He slides a small steel knife under the red wax seal. The wax cracks. The paper unfolds. Thomas Cadell holds the paper in his hands. He moves his eyes over the black ink. He reads the words written by George Austen. He looks at the paper for a few seconds. He reaches for his own feather quill. He dips it into his inkwell. He presses the wet tip directly onto the exact same sheet of paper George Austen sent him. He writes 5 words across the top of the page. He forms the letters to spell the phrase, "Declined by return of post." He folds the paper back into a square. He hands it directly back to the delivery man standing in front of him. The delivery man places the paper back into his leather bag. The carriage travels backward along the same cobblestone streets, gravel paths, and dirt roads. The horses pull the carriage miles away from the thick smoke of London. The mail carrier hands the folded paper back to George Austen in Steventon. George Austen breaks the new seal. He unfolds the paper. He looks at the fresh black ink written across the top of his original message. He sees the word declined. The thick stack of paper containing first impressions remains inside the wooden desk drawer in Steventon. The dark ink sits quietly on the rough paper fibers in the dark space. Jane sits at her flat wooden desk. She pulls a new stack of rough, blank paper toward her. She holds her sharpened feather quill. She dips the pointed tip into the small glass bottle of dark black ink. She presses the wet quill against the top sheet of paper. She writes the name Susan at the top center of the page. She begins writing a completely new sequence of words, describing a young woman walking through the stone corridors of an old abbey. She fills pages with this new story. In a few years, her brother will carry these new pages to a different London publisher, exchanging them for 10 heavy gold coins. That publisher will take the pages, place them inside a dark wooden desk drawer, and turn a metal key in the lock. Autumn 1798, Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Yellow and brown leaves detach from the high branches of the oak trees. They fall through the cool air and land on the wet soil outside the rectory window. The wind pushes against the thin glass panes. Inside her bedroom, Jane sits at her flat wooden desk. She pulls a thick stack of blank, rough-edged paper toward her. She holds her carved goose feather quill. She dips the sharp tip into the small glass bottle of dark black ink. The dark liquid coats the hollow point. The room smells of dry pine wood and the faint metallic scent of the iron sulfate mixed into the ink. Jane presses the wet quill against the top sheet of white paper. The paper features uneven, rough edges from the wooden drying frames at the paper mill. She forms the letters S-U-S-A-N. She writes the title Susan at the top center of the page. She begins to write long paragraphs describing a young woman traveling to a large, old stone building. She dips the quill repeatedly. The sharp tip scratches across the rough paper fibers. She writes sentences detailing the young woman walking down long, dark corridors. She describes the character, placing her hand on a heavy oak door, pushing the wood, and hearing the iron hinges squeal. She writes the character walking into a dark room and finding a large wooden chest resting on the floorboards. She details the character lifting the heavy wooden lid. Dust particles float up from the disturbed hinges. She writes the character expecting to find rolled parchment detailing secret murders or hidden daggers covered in dried blood. Jane writes the exact physical sequence of the character reaching into the chest and pulling out a folded piece of plain white paper. She writes the words detailing a simple laundry list. She writes the words cotton shirts, stockings, and linen cravats. She writes these specific physical details to directly contrast the printed books sold in London shops, which feature exaggerated stories of castles and ghosts. Jane writes the exact physical reality of the domestic world she observes every day in Hampshire. She fills hundreds of pages with these sequences. She completes the final page in 1799. The finished stack of paper measures over 2 inches thick. 4 years pass. The calendar marks the spring of 1803. A lawyer named William Seymour walks down the wet cobblestone streets of London. Carriages roll past him. The tall iron-rimmed wheels splash grey mud onto the stones. The air smells heavily of burning sea coal and raw sewage. Seymour wears a thick wool coat. He holds a flat leather portfolio under his arm. The thick stack of Jane's handwritten paper rests inside the leather case. Seymour walks to Stationer's Court. He pushes open the heavy wooden door of the publishing business owned by Benjamin Crosby and Company. A small brass bell attached to the top of the door rings loudly. The interior of the shop smells of wet black printer's ink, animal hide binding glue, and dry paper dust. In the back rooms, heavy iron printing presses clank loudly as men turn the large metal cranks. Seymour walks to a long oak counter. Benjamin Crosby stands behind the polished wood. Seymour opens the leather portfolio. He pulls out the 2-inch thick stack of paper. He places it flat on the counter. The heavy paper makes a loud slapping sound against the oak. Crosby looks at the black ink forming the title Susan on the top page. He reaches into a small wooden lockbox resting on a shelf. He pulls out 10 gold coins. The coins feature the stamped profile of the king on the flat metal surface. Crosby places the coins onto the oak counter one by one. The heavy gold discs click against the hardwood. Seymour picks up the 10 coins and slides them into a cloth pouch. He ties the strings of the pouch and walks out of the shop. The exact physical weight of these 10 gold coins translates to a specific mathematical value in the modern era. Taking the exact purchasing power of £10 from the year 1803, the currency buys exactly 300 cups of hot milk mixed with ground espresso beans sold in modern commercial coffee shops. This payment represents exactly 0.0001% of the physical currency Jane Austen's printed books generate in a single modern calendar year. Benjamin Crosby picks up the thick stack of paper from the counter. He walks to his large wooden desk. He pulls a brass handle attached to a drawer. The drawer slides outward along its wooden tracks. He places the paper flat inside the empty space. He pushes the drawer inward. The wood rubs against wood until the drawer face sits perfectly flush with the front of the desk. Crosby inserts a small brass key into the circular metal keyhole. He turns the key to the right. A small iron bolt slides into a groove. The lock clicks shut with a sharp metallic sound. Crosby takes his own quill and writes the title, Susan, on a small slip of paper. Workers in the back room press metal letters into wet ink to copy this slip. They paste the printed advertisements into the glass windows of London bookshops. The wooden drawer in Crosby's desk remains completely locked. Dust particles float through the air of the office and settle in a grey layer on the flat top of the desk. The stack of papers sits in total darkness. The iron gall ink dries completely into the woven paper fibers. The manuscript remains in this exact physical location, sealed inside the dark wood, for 13 consecutive years. 3 years before Benjamin Crosby turns the brass key in London, the temperature in Hampshire drops rapidly. The calendar marks the month of December in the year 1800. White frost forms on the exterior brick walls of the Steventon Rectory. The cold wind pushes against the bare branches of the oak trees. Inside the parlour, the heat from the burning logs in the brick fireplace warms the air. The smell of wood smoke fills the room. Jane sits on a wooden chair near the fire. Cassandra sits beside her on a small stool. Their mother rests on the upholstered cushions of the sofa. Reverend George Austen stands in the centre of the woven floor rug. He wears a heavy black wool coat. He looks at the faces of his family members. He opens his mouth. He pushes air from his lungs. He speaks a sequence of words announcing his immediate retirement from his clerical duties at the church. he instructs his wife and daughters to pack their cotton dresses, their wooden writing desks, and their bound books into heavy leather trunks. He describes their impending relocation away from the quiet dirt roads of Steventon, directing them toward the crowded, stone-paved streets of the city of Bath. Early spring 1801. Steventon Rectory, Hampshire. Large leather trunks rest open on the bare oak floorboards of the second-story bedroom. Heavy brass buckles hang loosely from thick leather straps attached to the lids. The air inside the room smells of dry dust and raw wool. The temperature remains cool. Jane stands beside the largest trunk. She holds a white muslin dress in her hands. She folds the fabric into a flat square. She presses the folded dress down into the bottom of the leather box. She reaches for a stack of thick, linen-bound notebooks. She places the heavy notebooks on top of the folded cotton. She places her flat, wooden writing slope into the trunk. She presses her hands against the heavy leather lid and pushes it downward. The brass hinges creak. She slides the thick leather straps through the metal buckles and pulls them tight. Downstairs, loud hollow thuds echo off the plaster walls. Men carry heavy wooden crates through the front door. The crates hold hundreds of leather-bound books from George Austen's library, flat ceramic plates from the kitchen, and thick wool blankets from the beds. The men load the crates onto large wooden carts parked on the dirt road outside. Jane walks down the wooden staircase. Her leather shoes hit the wooden steps, producing sharp clicking sounds in the empty hallway. The woven rugs are gone. The upholstered chairs are gone. The walls stand completely bare. She walks into the parlor. She looks at the empty corner where her small wooden desk previously stood. A rectangular patch of dark, unstained oak marks the exact location on the floorboards. She places her hand flat against the cold plaster wall. She stands in the empty room and listens to the wind blowing through the branches of the oak trees outside the window. She turns and walks out the heavy front door. She steps onto the damp gravel path. She climbs the metal steps of a waiting carriage. She sits on a padded leather bench inside the wooden cabin. Cassandra sits beside her. George and Cassandra Austen sit on the opposite bench. The driver cracks a long leather whip. The horses pull forward. Jane turns her head and looks through the small, square glass window of the carriage. She watches the red brick chimney of the Steventon Rectory recede into the distance. She keeps her eyes on the brick structure until a line of green trees entirely blocks the building from her line of sight. The horses pull the carriage over dirt roads, moving gradually onto wide, crushed gravel turnpikes. The tall wooden wheels roll for hours. The green fields of Hampshire transition into densely packed rows of tall stone buildings. The carriage wheels hit the large, flat paving stones of the city of Bath. The physical environment changes completely. Tall, uniform buildings made of pale yellow limestone rise on both sides of the street. Hundreds of brick chimneys release thick grey smoke into the air. The smoke settles over the city, carrying the smell of burning coal and hot soot. Loud noises fill the air. Iron horseshoes clatter rapidly against the hard cobblestones. Wooden carriage wheels rumble continuously. Vendors shout loudly, selling hot bread and printed newspapers from the pedestrian walkways. The dense stone architecture captures the sound waves and bounces them back toward the street, creating a constant, overlapping roar. The carriage stops in front of a tall, narrow terrace house on Sydney Place. Jane steps down onto the hard pavement. She walks into the rented house. The rooms feature high ceilings and tall, narrow windows. She climbs a steep, carpeted staircase to her new bedroom. She unpacks her leather trunk. She places her flat wooden writing slope onto a small table near the window. She sits in a wooden chair. She looks out the glass window. She sees the flat stone facades of identical houses positioned directly across the narrow street. She does not see dirt fields, green grass, or grazing farm animals. She opens the wooden compartment of her writing slope. A stack of blank, rough-edged paper sits inside. A glass bottle of dark ink rests in a small, circular recess. A sharpened goose feather quill lays flat beside the paper. Jane looks at the blank paper. She rests her hands in her lap. She sits in the chair. Hours pass. The sunlight shifts across the wooden table. The quill remains completely dry. The blank paper stays entirely white. The scratching sound of the metal-tipped feather against the paper fibers ceases. She stands up and walks away from the table. During the following months, Jane walks along the crowded pavements of Bath. She steps into the large, high-ceilinged room of the Grand Pump Room. Hundreds of people wearing heavy silk dresses and tailored wool coats stand in tight clusters on the polished stone floor. Jane walks to a long counter. A worker dips a glass cup into a flowing fountain of hot, thermal spring water. The water steams in the cool air. Jane takes the glass cup. She raises the rim to her lips. She drinks the hot liquid. The water tastes strongly of dissolved iron, sulfur, and salt. She returns to the tall stone house on Sydney Place. She walks past the wooden table, holding her writing slope. The dust particles in the air settle onto the blank paper, forming a thin grey layer over the white surface. The dark ink sits undisturbed inside the glass bottle. The physical production of large manuscript pages stops entirely. The calendar shifts forward. The date changes to December 1802. Jane packs a small leather bag with several cotton dresses and a thick wool cloak. She and Cassandra step into another horse-drawn carriage. The driver navigates the horses away from the loud stone streets of Bath, travelling back toward the quiet dirt roads of Hampshire. The carriage arrives at Manydown Park, a massive brick estate surrounded by vast acres of grass and ancient trees. Jane steps into a highly decorated drawing room. A large fire burns in a wide stone hearth, radiating intense heat. Jane sits on an upholstered sofa. A young man named Harris Bigwither stands on the thick woven rug directly in front of her. He wears a dark wool coat and a stiff white cravat. He is the legal heir to the massive brick estate and the surrounding fields. He looks down at Jane. He opens his mouth. He pushes air from his lungs, vibrating his vocal cords to deliver a specific sequence of spoken words, asking her to enter a binding legal marriage contract. December 2nd, 1802, Manydown Park, Hampshire. Harris Bigwither finishes speaking his sequence of words. Thick wax candles burn in tall silver candelabras, illuminating the painted plaster walls of the drawing room. The heat from the large stone hearth radiates outward, warming the heavy wool rug under Jane's leather shoes. Jane looks at his face. She opens her mouth. She vibrates her own vocal cords. She speaks a sequence of words stating her acceptance of his proposal. Harris Bigwither possesses the paper deeds to the massive brick structure of Manydown Park. The property encompasses thousands of acres of dirt fields, mature oak trees, and stone outbuildings. The main house contains dozens of rooms. Servants polish carved oak furniture, scrub silver serving dishes, and beat dust from thick woven tapestries. By speaking her acceptance, Jane secures physical access to these resources. She secures a continuous supply of roasted meat, hot tea, and burning coal for herself, her sister Cassandra, and her aging parents. The evening ends. Jane walks out of the drawing room. She climbs the wide wooden staircase to her assigned bedroom on the second floor. Her leather shoes tap against the flat wooden treads. She opens the heavy oak door and steps into the room. She removes her silk dress and puts on a white cotton nightgown. She lies down on the thick feather mattress. Cassandra lies on the mattress beside her. Jane pulls the heavy wool blankets up to her chest. She closes her eyes. The room is dark. The embers in the bedroom grate fade from bright orange to dull red. The air temperature drops. The room smells of dying wood smoke and cold plaster. Jane opens her eyes. She stares at the flat plaster ceiling. She shifts her physical weight on the mattress. The tightly pulled ropes beneath the mattress stretch and creak under the shifting weight. She turns onto her right side. She breathes air into her lungs and pushes it out. She turns onto her left side. The linen sheets rustle against her cotton nightgown. She listens to the physical sounds of the large stone house. The wind pushes against the thick glass window panes, making the wooden frames rattle. Wooden floorboards in the hallway contract in the cold air, producing sharp cracking noises. A large clock on the lower floor chimes. A metal hammer strikes a brass bell, marking the exact progression of the hours. The sound waves travel up the staircase and through the wooden door of the bedroom. Jane lies awake on the mattress. She moves her arms and legs continuously. She shifts her head against the linen pillow. The dark room slowly fills with morning light. Yellow sunlight filters through the thin gaps between the heavy velvet window curtains. Dust particles float in the narrow beams of light. It is the morning of December 3rd, 1802. Jane pushes the heavy blankets off her body. She places her bare feet onto the cold wooden floorboards. She removes her cotton nightgown and puts on a dark wool dress. She fastens the small metal hooks and buttons along the back of the thick fabric. She walks out of the bedroom. She descends the wooden staircase. She walks back into the drawing room. Harris Bigwither stands near the stone hearth. Jane walks across the woven rug and stands directly in front of him. She looks at his face. She opens her mouth. She pushes air through her vocal cords. She speaks a new sequence of words. She states her withdrawal of her previous acceptance. She speaks her rejection of the offer. Harris Bigwither listens to the spoken words. The muscles in his face shift. He changes his physical posture, stepping backward on the rug. Jane turns and walks out of the drawing room. She walks rapidly down the long corridor, back to the bedroom. She opens her thick leather trunks. She folds her cotton dresses and places them inside the trunks. Cassandra folds her own clothes and places them beside Jane's clothes. They pull the thick leather straps through the brass buckles and pull them tight. They instruct a servant to carry the heavy leather trunks out the front door. A carriage pulled by horses arrives on the gravel driveway. The driver pulls the leather reins, stopping the horses. Jane and Cassandra step onto the metal steps and sit on the padded leather bench inside the wooden cabin. The driver cracks his leather whip. The horses pull the carriage away from the massive brick estate. The iron-rimmed wheels crush the gravel on the driveway. Jane looks out the small glass window. She watches the stone walls of Manydown Park recede into the distance. She travels away from the acres of dirt fields, the thick oak forests, and the vast supply of physical gold and silver coins. She retains her small wooden writing slope, her glass inkwell, and her stacks of blank paper. The horses pull the carriage over the dirt roads of Hampshire. The animals breathe heavily, exhaling plumes of white vapor into the cold air. The carriage eventually merges onto the wide turnpikes, leading back to the crowded stone streets of Bath. The iron horseshoes strike the flat paving stones of the city. Jane returns to the tall, narrow terrace house on Sydney Place. She unpacks her leather trunk. She places her writing slope on the small wooden table. She resumes her daily physical routine in Bath. She walks on the hard paving stones. She drinks hot, sulphur-scented thermal water from glass cups in the grand pump room. The position of the sun in the sky shifts over the following months. White snow falls on the slate roofs of Bath. The snow melts into liquid water and flows down the stone gutters into the river Avon. Green leaves grow on the branches of the trees, turn brown, and detach from the wood. A paper calendar on the wall of the rented house on Green Park Buildings displays the year 1805. Thick grey smoke from hundreds of coal fires hangs over the stone buildings of the city. Inside the house, Reverend George Austen lies flat on a wooden bed. He breathes rapidly in short, shallow gasps. The physical organs inside his body cease their regular functions. January 21st, 1805. Bath. Grey smoke from hundreds of coal fires hangs in the cold winter air directly above the slate roofs of Green Park Buildings. Frost coats the flat limestone paving stones outside the rented house. The air temperature is low. Inside the house, a small pile of black coal burns in an iron grate. The burning lumps crack and hiss, sending small orange sparks against the metal bars. The room smells of sharp coal smoke and damp wool. Reverend George Austen lies entirely still on a wooden bed. He breathes his final sequence of shallow breaths. The air enters his lungs and leaves his lungs. The muscles in his chest stop contracting. His physical body ceases all movement. The only sounds in the room are the ticking of a small brass clock resting on the wooden mantelpiece and the popping of the coal in the grate. The metal pendulum swings left and right inside its glass case. Jane, Cassandra, and their mother stand on the bare floorboards beside the bed. They look directly at the still physical body of their father. Men from the local church arrive at the house. They lift a heavy wooden coffin containing the body. They carry the large wooden box out the front door and load it onto a cart. They transport the box to a churchyard in the city. Men hold iron shovels with long wooden handles. They push the sharp metal blades into the cold, damp dirt. They dig a deep, rectangular hole in the ground. They lower the wooden box into the hole. They shovel the heavy, wet soil back over the wood, filling the hole completely to the surface. Back inside the rented house on Green Park Buildings, the regular influx of physical currency abruptly stops. The church pension George Austen received ceases on the exact day his body stops moving. The three women possess a very small quantity of silver coins in their cloth purses. They sit in the parlor on upholstered chairs. A postal courier walks to the front door and hands them folded paper letters sealed with red wax. Jane breaks the brittle wax seals with her fingers. She unfolds the thick paper. Inside the letters, her brothers place flat paper banknotes and heavy silver coins. The brothers write sequences of words promising to send a specific quantity of physical money every calendar year. Jane takes the silver coins and hands them to the owner of the house. She hands the flat banknotes to men selling roasted meat, white flour, and large chunks of black coal. The women rely entirely on the continuous arrival of these physical objects in the mail to maintain their access to food and shelter. A few months prior to this date, around the year 1804, Jane sits at her slanted wooden writing slope. She dips her carved feather quill into a small glass bottle filled with dark black ink. She presses the sharp tip against the rough surface of a blank sheet of paper. She writes the words, "The Watsons," at the top of the page. She moves her hand from left to right, filling the page with lines of text. She writes physical descriptions of a young woman attending a crowded ball in a small town. She fills several pages with wet ink. She stops writing. She lifts the quill from the paper. She places the feather down on the wooden desk. She gathers the handwritten pages, aligns the rough edges with her fingers, and places the small stack inside a wooden drawer. She places the remaining blank pages back into the drawer as well. The physical manuscript of the Watsons remains in this unfinished state. The calendar changes to the year 1806. The women open their heavy leather trunks. They fold their cotton dresses and pack their wooden writing slopes. They secure the thick leather straps with brass buckles. They step into a carriage. The driver whips the horses. The carriage rolls away from the tall, pale limestone buildings of Bath. The horses pull the carriage to the port city of Southampton. The women move into a rented house situated near the deep water of the English Channel. They share this physical space with their close friend, Martha Lloyd, their brother Frank, and Frank's wife. The air in Southampton smells of salty ocean water, rotting seaweed, and wet tar. Inside the rented house, multiple people occupy the small rooms. Heavy footsteps strike the wooden floorboards constantly from morning until night. Wooden chairs scrape against the floor. Loud voices echo off the plaster walls. Jane sits in the crowded parlor. She listens to the overlapping sounds of the voices. Her wooden writing slope sits closed and locked on a side table. Dust particles settle onto the polished wood. Her glass inkwell stays sealed. Her feather quills remain completely dry. Jane walks out of the house. She walks along the old stone walls surrounding the city of Southampton. She looks out over the grey water. Large wooden ships float in the harbour. Thick hemp ropes slap against the tall wooden masts in the wind. White seagulls fly through the air, making loud, sharp calls. Jane walks back to the rented house. She sits in a wooden chair. The days pass. The sun rises and sets. The women consume the food purchased with the coins sent by the brothers. The physical production of large manuscript pages remains halted for several consecutive years. The calendar changes to July 1809. The women pull their heavy leather trunks back into the center of the bedrooms. They pack their dresses, stockings, and wooden writing desks into the boxes. They pull the thick leather straps tightly through the brass buckles. They carry the trunks out the front door and strap them to the back of a waiting carriage. Jane, Cassandra, their mother, and Martha Lloyd climb up the metal steps. They sit on the padded leather benches inside the wooden cabin. The driver clicks his tongue. The horses step forward. The iron-rimmed wheels roll over the cobblestones, moving away from the salty air and loud docks of Southampton. The horses pull the carriage along the winding dirt roads of the Hampshire countryside. They travel directly toward a small, two-story brick building situated precisely at the intersection of two dirt roads. The building features a steep roof covered in flat red clay tiles. Tall brick chimneys rise above the roofline. A sturdy oak door with an iron handle marks the front entrance. Brother Edward holds the legal paper deeds to this specific property. He grants the women physical access to the space in exchange for zero physical currency. The horses walk steadily toward this solid brick structure, bringing Jane directly to the permanent wooden desk she will use to write out hundreds of new pages. July 7th, 1809. Chawton, Hampshire. The hot summer sun beats down on the dry dirt of the Winchester Road. A horse-drawn carriage halts. The iron rims of the wooden wheels grind to a stop against the loose gravel. The heavy breathing of the horses fills the warm air. The driver pulls the metal handle and opens the wooden door of the carriage. Jane Austen, her sister, Cassandra, her mother, and their friend Martha Lloyd step down onto the solid ground. Their leather shoes sink slightly into the dry dust. They stand directly in front of a two-story brick building. The exterior walls consist of dark red bricks held together by thick lines of grey mortar. Flat red clay tiles cover the steep roof. Tall brick chimneys rise above the roofline. 6 large glass windows face the dirt turnpike. A low wooden fence separates a small front garden from the public road. The air smells of dry summer grass, road dust, and the hot metal of the carriage hardware. Men lift heavy leather trunks from the back of the carriage. They carry the trunks through the front gate, across the short gravel path, and through the heavy oak front door. The door swings inward on large iron hinges. The women walk over the wooden threshold. They step onto the solid oak floorboards of the ground floor. The interior of the house smells of dry plaster, old wood, and fresh beeswax used to polish the floors. Brother Edward holds the legal paper deeds to this specific physical structure. He possesses vast tracts of land and multiple large stone estates across the country. He transfers full physical access to the cottage directly to his mother and sisters. The women keep their silver coins inside their cloth purses. They now possess a permanent, stable, physical location. They walk through the rooms on the ground floor. They place wooden chairs around the stone hearth in the parlor. They carry their wool blankets up the narrow, turning wooden staircase to the second floor bedrooms. Cassandra organizes the kitchen in the back of the house. She places ceramic bowls on the wooden shelves. She sets heavy iron pots on the stone floor near the large brick baking oven. Martha Lloyd fills a brass kettle with water from the outside iron pump and hangs it over the indoor grate. Jane walks into the dining parlor, situated at the front of the house. A single large window looks directly out onto the dirt road and the green bushes of the garden. Jane places a small, circular walnut table near this window. The table features a flat, smooth top and 3 curved wooden legs. She pulls a straight-backed wooden chair up to the table. She sets her glass inkwell and her carved feather quills onto the polished wood. A heavy wooden door separates this dining parlor from the front hallway. Iron hinges attach the door to the wooden frame. When a person pushes the door open, the metal hinges rub together. The physical friction produces a loud, high-pitched squeak. Jane leaves the metal hinges completely dry. She sits at the walnut table. The bright yellow sunlight shines through the glass window, illuminating the dark grain of the wood. She listens continuously to the ambient sounds of the house. When a visitor approaches the house, they push open the front door and step into the hallway. They push the parlor door. The dry metal hinge squeaks loudly. The sound waves travel through the air directly to Jane's ears. She immediately slides her flat sheets of handwritten paper under a large, rectangular piece of thick blotting paper. The visitor walks into the room and sees only the clean, flat surface of the blotting pad resting on the table. The sun rises and sets over the red clay roof tiles day after day. The women repeat their physical movements through the rooms each morning. Jane walks to her bedroom on the second floor. She opens the thick leather straps of her trunk. She reaches her hands down to the very bottom of the box. She pulls out the thick stacks of heavy paper she filled with ink years earlier at the Steventon Rectory. She lifts the heavy manuscript originally titled Eleanor and Marianne. She lifts the manuscript originally titled First Impressions. She carries these thick stacks of paper down the wooden staircase. She places them squarely onto the top of the walnut table in the dining parlor. She sits in the wooden chair. She picks up a small steel knife and cuts the tip of a fresh goose feather into a sharp point. She dips the tip into the small glass inkwell. The dark black liquid coats the hollow quill. The metallic scent of iron sulfate rises from the wet ink. Jane presses the wet quill against the old paper. She drags the sharp point through the dried ink, drawing thick black lines through long sentences. She writes completely new words in the empty margins of the paper. She crosses out entire pages. She covers the original letter headings of Eleanor and Marianne with fresh ink. She rewrites the narrative into standard continuous prose paragraphs. She dips the quill repeatedly, making a soft scratching noise against the rough paper fibers. She titles the newly revised stack of paper Sense and Sensibility. She writes hundreds of new pages. She dips the quill and presses the ink onto the paper day after day. The pile of revised paper grows thicker on the right side of the desk. She taps the edges of the pages against the flat wooden table, aligning them perfectly into a solid, rectangular block. She wraps the entire stack in thick brown paper. She ties a heavy hemp string around the package, pulling the knots tight. She hands this physical object to her brother Henry. Henry takes the heavy package in his hands. He walks out of the brick cottage. He steps onto the metal steps of a carriage. The carriage travels eastward over the dirt turnpikes. The horses pull the wooden cabin directly toward the crowded cobblestone streets of London. Henry carries the bound stack of paper into the physical shop of a printer named Thomas Egerton, setting the heavy pages onto a wooden counter surrounded by the smell of wet, black printing ink and dry paper dust. October 1811, Whitehall, London. The heavy wheels of wooden carriages rattle over the wet cobblestone streets outside the military library. The air near the buildings smells of burning sea coal, horse manure, and wet wool. Inside the shop, owned by Thomas Egerton, the scent changes completely. The interior air carries the sharp chemical odor of boiling linseed oil, pine resin, and lamp-black soot. Dust from dry linen paper floats in the dim light. In the back room of the shop, men stand in front of large wooden cabinets. The cabinets contain dozens of small square compartments. Each compartment holds hundreds of tiny, identical lead blocks. A single letter of the alphabet projects outward from the top of each block. The men reach their fingers into the wooden compartments. They pick up the small metal blocks one by one. They arrange the blocks in a straight row inside a heavy iron frame. They place the letters in reverse order. They arrange specific letters to spell the words sense and sensibility. Below this line, they arrange another sequence of metal blocks. They select the letters B, Y, A, L, A, D, or Y. They leave the metal blocks spelling Jane Austen's legal name entirely out of the iron frame. A worker picks up 2 large leather balls stuffed with raw sheep's wool. The leather is soaked in thick, sticky black ink. He forcefully presses the 2 inked leather balls against the raised metal letters in the iron frame. The black ink coats the lead. Another man takes a large, blank sheet of damp linen paper. He lays the damp paper carefully over the inked metal blocks. He turns a heavy iron crank attached to a large wooden printing press. A flat wooden board lowers down. The board presses the damp paper directly against the wet lead letters with immense physical force. The man turns the crank in the opposite direction. The wooden board rises. He peels the paper off the metal. Sharp, uniform black letters now cover the white surface of the page. The men hang the wet paper over wooden racks suspended from the ceiling. The air in the room dries the ink into a solid, matte black. Workers take the dry sheets of printed paper. They fold the large sheets multiple times to create small, rectangular pages. They use thick steel needles to push linen thread through the folded edges, binding the pages together. They glue thick paper boards to the outsides of the folded stacks. They cover the boards in blue paper and the spines in plain brown paper. They place the finished objects on the flat wooden counters at the front of the shop. Thomas Egerton holds a signed paper contract regarding these books. The black ink on the contract outlines a publication on commission. Jane Austen holds the entire physical risk of the printing process. She pays the physical currency required to purchase the blank paper, the black ink, and the labor of the men turning the iron crank. If customers leave the blue paper books on the wooden shelves, Jane loses her gold coins. If customers exchange their coins for the books, Jane keeps the copyright and receives the profit. Customers walk through the wooden door of the military library. They wear heavy wool coats and thick leather boots. They approach the wooden counter. They place silver shillings and heavy gold coins onto the flat oak surface. The metal coins clink against the wood. The customers pick up the blue paper books. They carry the printed volumes out of the shop and back onto the wet cobblestones of London. The 3 volumes of Sense and Sensibility disappear from the shelves. Customers purchase every single printed copy in the shop. Thomas Egerton stacks the silver and gold coins left on the counter. He calculates the total sum. He separates the physical cost of the paper and the ink. He places the remaining coins into a leather pouch. The pouch contains exactly £140. Thomas Egerton hands this heavy pouch to Henry Austen. Henry transfers the physical currency directly to Jane. Jane holds the heavy metal coins and the flat paper banknotes in her own hands. In the brick cottage at Chawton, the cold November wind blows against the thick glass window of the dining parlour. A mail carrier knocks his knuckles against the heavy oak front door. He hands a package to the maid. The package consists of a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper and tied tightly with rough hemp string. Jane sits at her small walnut table. She takes the heavy package. She slides the sharp blade of a steel knife under the hemp string. The blade cuts through the dry fibers. The string falls away. She unfolds the thick brown paper. 3 identical books rest on the table. They feature the blue paper boards and the brown paper spines. Jane picks up the first volume. The object possesses a distinct physical weight in her hands. The bound pages smell of fresh glue, dried black ink, and pressed linen. She opens the thick front cover. The paper pages feel smooth and stiff. She looks at the title page. She sees the black letters spelling the title. She sees the words, "By a Lady." She turns the page. She reads the printed text. She sees the exact sequences of words she wrote with her wet feather quill inside the Steventon Rectory years earlier. The messy, crossed-out handwriting from her loose manuscript pages now exists as perfectly uniform, straight black lines impressed deep into the paper. Jane runs her fingertips over the black ink. She turns the pages one by one. The dry paper rustles softly in the quiet room. She closes the cover of the 3rd volume. She places the 3 books in a neat stack on the corner of the walnut table. She reaches her hand toward the small wooden drawer in the table. She pulls the brass handle. The drawer slides open, making a low scraping sound. She reaches inside and pulls out another thick stack of handwritten paper. The top page features the heavily crossed-out words, "First Impressions." She places the stack flat on the desk. She picks up her steel knife and carves a sharp new point onto her goose feather quill. She dips the quill into the small glass bottle of dark black ink. She begins the exact physical process of crossing out the old words and writing completely new sentences, preparing a manuscript about a woman named Elizabeth Bennet to send to Thomas Egerton by January 1813. Late January 1813. Chawton, Hampshire. White snow covers the frozen dirt of the Winchester Road. The air temperature drops below the freezing point of water. Frost forms on the outer surface of the glass window panes at the front of the brick cottage. The wind blows from the north. The bare branches of the oak trees rattle together, producing a dry, clicking sound. Inside the dining parlor, the air holds a high temperature. Thick oak logs burn in the brick hearth. The flames produce a bright orange light and a steady crackling noise. The smell of burning wood fills the room. Jane sits on a wooden chair at the small walnut table near the window. She wears a thick wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her leather shoes rest flat on the oak floorboards. A man walks up the gravel path outside the window. His heavy leather boots crush the small stones and frozen dirt. He steps onto the stone block in front of the door. He raises his hand. He knocks his knuckles hard against the solid oak wood. The heavy thud echoes through the hallway. A maid opens the door. The cold outside air rushes into the house. The man hands the maid a rectangular package wrapped in thick brown paper. The package is tied tightly with a rough hemp string. The maid walks into the parlor. She hands the heavy package to Jane. The brown paper smells of cold outdoor air and wet horsehair from the mail carriage. Jane takes the package. She places it squarely onto the flat surface of the walnut table. She picks up a small steel knife. She slides the sharp metal blade under the tight hemp string. She pulls the blade upward. The steel cuts through the dry plant fibers. The string separates and falls onto the table. Jane unfolds the thick brown paper. 3 identical books rest on the polished wood. The covers consist of stiff cardboard wrapped in blue paper. Plain brown paper covers the flat spines. Jane picks up the first volume. The bound pages carry a distinct physical weight in her hands. The object smells of animal hide, binding glue, dry linen paper, and black printer's ink. She opens the thick front cover. She looks at the title page. Black letters pressed deep into the white paper spell the words Pride and Prejudice. A second line of printed text below the title reads, "By the author of Sense and Sensibility." Jane traces her fingertips over the black ink. She turns the rough paper pages one by one. The dry paper rustles softly in the quiet room. She sees the exact sequences of words she wrote years earlier in the Steventon Rectory, now locked into uniform, straight lines of lead type. Jane does not hold the legal copyright to this specific arrangement of printed words. Months earlier, she signed a flat sheet of paper transferring the exact legal ownership of the text to the London publisher Thomas Egerton. In exchange, Thomas Egerton handed her brother, Henry, a leather pouch containing exactly £110 in physical currency. The pouch held heavy gold coins and silver shillings. Jane accepted the metal coins. Thomas Egerton retains all future physical currency exchanged for these blue paper books in his London shop. He keeps the silver and gold coins customers leave on his wooden counter. Jane places the printed volume back onto the table. She pulls a blank, rough-edged sheet of writing paper from the wooden drawer. She picks up her goose feather quill. She holds her small steel knife and cuts the tip of the feather into a sharp new point. She dips the hollow tip into her small glass inkwell. The dark liquid coats the quill. She presses the wet ink against the blank paper. She writes a sequence of words directed to her sister, Cassandra. The sharp point scratches across the paper fibers. She moves her hand to form letters spelling the phrase, "My own darling child." She refers to the printed book resting on the table. She folds the paper, melts red wax over the edge, presses a brass seal into the puddle, and leaves the sealed letter on a silver tray for the mail carrier. 60 miles away, thick grey coal smoke hangs over the wet cobblestone streets of London. Heavy wooden carriages pull up to the front door of Thomas Egerton's shop on Whitehall. Men and women wearing long silk dresses and tailored wool coats step out of the carriages. They walk through the wooden door. They approach the flat oak counter. They place heavy gold coins and silver shillings onto the wood. The metal clinks loudly. The shop assistants hand the customers copies of the blue paper books. The customers carry the 3 volumes out of the shop. They step back into their carriages. The carriages travel to large, multi-story stone houses in Mayfair. The men and women walk into highly decorated drawing rooms. They sit on upholstered chairs beside marble fireplaces. They open the covers of the books. They look at the black ink. They open their mouths and push air through their vocal cords. They read the dialogue of the character Elizabeth Bennet out loud to the other people in the room. They speak the words detailing Elizabeth walking 3 miles across muddy fields. They describe the physical mud coating the bottom hem of her cotton dress. They read the printed sentences detailing Elizabeth speaking rapidly and directly to wealthy men sitting in large drawing rooms. The listeners laugh. They expel short bursts of air from their lungs and pull their lips back, exposing their teeth. They close the books. They lean forward in their chairs. They speak loud sequences of words exchanging names of specific people living in London. They guess the exact identity of the human being who wrote the words. They point their fingers at the blue covers. The name of the author remains completely absent from the title page. Back in the dining parlour at Chawton, the winter sun drops below the horizon. The bright light fades from the glass window. The fire in the hearth burns down to glowing red coals. Jane pushes the 3 volumes of Pride and Prejudice to the far corner of the walnut table. She reaches her hand into the open drawer. She pulls out a fresh stack of completely blank paper. She sets the stack precisely in the center of the desk. She picks up her feather quill. She dips the tip into the black ink. She presses the wet point against the top sheet of paper. She writes the title, Mansfield Park. She begins to write sentences describing a completely new character. She writes the name, Fanny Price. She writes physical descriptions of a young, quiet girl standing silently in the corner of a massive stone estate, observing the loud conversations of wealthy relatives. She fills the blank page with wet ink. She will complete hundreds of pages featuring this introverted character, eventually wrapping the thick stack in brown paper to send back to London. She will return to publishing on commission, paying for the ink and paper herself, and she will keep the heavy gold coins generated by the sales. May 1814. Whitehall, London. Yellow sunlight hits the flat, wet cobblestones of the street. Carriages with tall wooden wheels roll past the stone buildings. The iron rims splash brown mud against the curbs. The air smells of damp horsehair, wet wool coats, and burning sea coal. Men and women walk through the heavy wooden door of Thomas Egerton's publishing shop. The interior smells of dried animal hide glue, sharp black printer's ink, and dry linen paper. Customers stand in front of the flat oak counter. They open cloth purses. They place heavy gold coins and silver shillings onto the polished wood. The metal clinks loudly. The shop assistants slide the coins into wooden lockboxes. The assistants hand the customers thick stacks of folded paper bound in blue paperboards. The title page of the books features sharp black letters. The ink spells the words Mansfield Park. Below the title, the ink spells, by the author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. The customers hold the books in their hands. They carry the physical volumes out the door. They step into their carriages. They ride away. Inside the blue paper boards, the black ink forms sentences describing a specific physical location. The ink details a large stone estate. It describes a young woman named Fanny Price. The handwritten manuscript pages Jane produced at her walnut table now exist as printed text. The printed sentences describe Fanny Price sitting on a wooden stool in a quiet corner of a large parlour. The ink details Fanny keeping her lips pressed tightly together. She moves her eyes. She watches her relatives walk across the woven rugs. She listens to the loud vibrations of their vocal cords. The ink describes the wealthy relatives using steel hammers to drive iron nails into thick wooden planks. They build a raised wooden stage directly inside the parlour. They pull heavy green cloth across the boards. They stand on the stage holding rolled paper scripts. They raise their voices and exaggerate their physical movements, speaking lines from a printed play. Fanny sits on her stool. She breathes the air. She watches their hands move. She observes their physical actions. Jane sits in her brick cottage in Chawton. The May breeze blows through the open window. smelling of wet grass and blooming lilac bushes. She holds a folded paper contract. The black ink on the contract outlines a publication on commission. Jane assumes the entire physical cost of the materials. She pays the physical currency for the blank linen paper. She pays the currency for the black printer's ink. She pays the men who turn the heavy iron cranks of the printing presses. Because she pays for the physical materials, she keeps the physical profits. Thomas Egerton holds the books on his wooden shelves. He collects the coins from the customers. He subtracts a specific quantity of coins for his commission. He places the remaining coins into a leather pouch for Jane. The sun rises and sets over the red clay tiles of the Chawton cottage. The calendar pages turn. June passes. July passes. October arrives. Inside Thomas Egerton's shop, the final blue paper book leaves the wooden shelf. A customer carries it out the door. The entire first edition of Mansfield Park vanishes into the hands of the public in exactly 6 months. Thomas Egerton places heavy gold coins and flat paper banknotes into a thick leather pouch. He hands the pouch to Henry Austen. Henry carries the heavy pouch out of the shop. He travels over the dirt turnpikes in a wooden carriage. He carries the pouch through the front door of the Chawton cottage. He places it squarely on the small walnut table. Jane opens the leather pouch. She reaches her hands inside. She pulls out the gold coins. She sets them flat on the polished walnut wood. She touches the paper banknotes. The total count equals £310. This specific quantity of physical currency represents the largest single financial return she receives during her life. Jane gathers the coins. She slides them back into the leather pouch. She pulls the leather strings tight. She hands portions of these coins to local merchants. She exchanges the gold and silver for heavy cuts of roasted beef, sacks of white flour, and large chunks of black coal. The physical fuel keeps the fire burning in the brick hearth. The heat warms the air of the dining parlor. Jane sits at her desk. She dips her quill. She writes new sentences. Carriage drivers carry the blue paper books inside leather bags across the country. They deliver the books to massive stone estates, tall terrace houses, and country rectories. People sit in upholstered chairs. They open the covers. They look at the ink. They read the descriptions of Fanny Price. In the City of London, a specific physical copy of Mansfield Park travels to a massive stone palace named Carlton House. The palace sits behind tall iron gates. Inside the palace, heavy gold chandeliers hang from painted plaster ceilings. Tall, clear mirrors attach to the walls, reflecting the light of thousands of thick wax candles. Red velvet carpets cover the stone floors. A man named James Stanier Clark sits at a large mahogany desk inside the palace library. He works as the librarian for the Prince Regent. The Prince Regent occupies the highest royal position in the country. He wears silk coats covered in heavy silver thread. He wears large diamonds and rubies on his fingers. The Prince Regent reads the blue paper books. He reads the black ink. He instructs James Stanier Clark to write a letter. James Stanier Clark dips a feather quill into a glass inkwell. He presses the wet tip against a thick sheet of white paper. He writes a sequence of words directed to Jane Austen. He writes that the Prince Regent reads her books. He writes an invitation. He asks Jane to travel over the cobblestone streets. He asks her to step her leather shoes onto the red velvet carpets of Carlton House. The wet ink dries. He folds the paper. He melts red wax over the edge. He presses a brass seal into the hot wax. He hands the paper to a royal messenger. The messenger walks out of the heavy stone doors of the palace. He carries the invitation directly toward Jane Austen. Autumn 1815. Pall Mall, London. Grey clouds block the direct light of the sun. A cold wind blows off the surface of the River Thames, carrying the smell of wet river mud and burning sea coal. Heavy wooden carriages roll over the wet cobblestones. The iron horseshoes strike the hard stone, creating sharp, continuous clacking sounds. A carriage stops in front of a massive stone wall. Jane Austen steps down from the carriage. Her flat leather shoes press against the damp pavement. She stands before the tall, black iron gates of Carlton House. The massive stone building serves as the central London residence of the Prince Regent. Tall stone columns rise from the ground to support the heavy roof. Jane walks through the open iron gates. She crosses the paved courtyard. Two men wearing bright red wool coats open the heavy wooden front doors. Jane steps over the threshold and enters the palace. The air inside the building holds a high temperature. Hundreds of thick, white wax candles burn inside massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the high plaster ceilings. The yellow flames reflect off thousands of cut glass prisms. The intense heat from the burning wicks melts the beeswax. The air smells of hot wax, heavy floral perfumes, and polished mahogany wood. Thick red velvet carpets cover the stone floors. As Jane walks, the heavy wool fibers absorb the sound of her footsteps. She walks past tall mirrors framed in carved wood, covered with thin sheets of gold leaf. A man stands on the red carpet in the center of a long hallway. His name is James Stanier Clark. He wears a dark, tailored wool suit and a crisp white cotton cravat. He functions as the official librarian for the Prince Regent. He lowers his chin toward his chest, acknowledging Jane's arrival. He turns and walks down the long, illuminated corridor. Jane follows him. They walk through a set of tall double doors. They enter the royal library. 4 walls of solid oak shelving rise directly from the floorboards to the painted ceiling. Thousands of thick books rest on the flat wooden shelves. The book covers consist of dark red, deep green, and dark brown calfskin leather. Gold flakes pressed into the leather form straight lines and clear letters on the spines. The room smells of dry paper, old animal hide, binding glue, and dust. James Stanier Clark stops, walking. He turns his body to face Jane. He opens his mouth. He pushes air from his lungs, vibrating his vocal cords. He speaks a sequence of words. He states that the Prince Regent reads the blue paper books Jane produces. He states that the Prince keeps a printed copy of Mansfield Park in every royal residence. He speaks a direct instruction. He asks Jane to place the Prince Regent's legal title at the very front of her next printed volume. He asks her to write a formal dedication to the royal figure. Jane looks at his face. She lowers her chin. She vibrates her own vocal cords and speaks her agreement. Jane leaves the palace. She walks back across the red velvet carpets. She steps out the heavy wooden doors and returns to the cold, damp air of the London street. She travels to her brother Henry's house on Hans Place. The house features red brick walls and narrow glass windows. Jane walks into a quiet room on the ground floor. She sits on a wooden chair, pulled close to a flat wooden writing desk. A massive stack of handwritten paper rests on the desk. The stack measures several inches thick. The rough sheets of linen paper contain hundreds of thousands of black ink marks. The ink spells out a completely new sequence of sentences. The top page bears the title, Emma. Jane picks up her carved goose feather quill. She dips the sharp point into a glass bottle filled with dark black ink. She pulls a blank sheet of paper from a drawer. She presses the wet tip of the feather against the white paper. She moves her hand left and right. She forms the letters, spelling out a formal dedication to His Royal Highness, the Prince Regent. She places this single sheet of paper squarely on top of the massive manuscript. Inside the thick stack of paper, the black ink describes a young, wealthy woman named Emma Woodhouse. Jane manipulates the ink to restrict the physical perspective of the text. She writes sentences describing only the specific physical objects existing directly in front of Emma's eyes. She describes the exact sounds entering Emma's ears. She writes the physical dialogue of neighbors sitting in drawing rooms, drinking hot tea from porcelain cups, and discussing marriage contracts. The ink details Emma rearranging the physical bodies of her friends, instructing them to stand next to specific men and speak specific words. In December 1815, a man named John Murray takes possession of this thick stack of paper. John Murray operates a large publishing house on Albemarle Street in London. In the back rooms of his shop, men arrange thousands of tiny lead blocks into solid iron frames. They coat the raised metal letters with thick, sticky black ink. They place blank sheets of white paper over the metal blocks. They pull heavy iron levers. A flat wooden board crushes the paper against the wet ink. The physical force pushes the black liquid deep into the paper fibers. The men hang the pages to dry. They bind the pages between brown paper boards. They print the dedication to the Prince Regent on the very first page. Customers walk into the shop on Albemarle Street. They place heavy silver coins on the oak counter. They carry the brown paper books out into the cold winter air. Jane travels away from the cobblestone streets of London. She sits inside a wooden carriage. The horses pull the carriage over the dirt turnpikes, returning her to the brick cottage in Chawton. The calendar changes to the early months of 1816. Snow falls on the red clay roof tiles of the cottage. Jane sits on the wooden chair inside the dining parlour. The temperature of the air drops. She wraps a thick, woven wool shawl around her shoulders. A deep, persistent ache settles into the joints of her knees and the muscles of her lower back. The physical mass of her body begins to decrease. The skin on her face changes colour. In London, her brother Henry sits at his own wooden desk. He opens a thick leather-bound accounting ledger. He looks at the numbers written in black ink. The numbers represent the physical gold and silver coins held in his banking business. The ink shows a total of 0 coins. The bank holds no currency. Jane remains in her wooden chair in the parlour. She pulls a fresh stack of blank paper onto the walnut table. She picks up her feather quill. She dips the tip into the inkwell. She presses the wet point against the paper to write the title, Persuasion. Her hand moves slower across the rough paper fibers. Early 1816. Chawton, Hampshire. Cold rain falls from grey clouds. The water droplets hit the flat red clay tiles, covering the roof of the Chawton cottage. The water runs down the angled slope of the roof and drips onto the wet soil below. The bare branches of the oak trees sway in the wind. Inside the dining parlor, the air holds a low temperature. Jane sits on a wooden chair at the small walnut table. She pulls a thick, woven wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. She wears a long cotton dress. She rests her leather shoes flat against the oak floorboards. A fire burns in the brick hearth across the room. The burning logs produce a steady crackling noise. The flames emit orange light and heat. Jane holds her carved goose feather quill. She dips the sharp point into the small glass bottle of dark black ink. She presses the wet tip against a rough sheet of linen paper. She writes a sequence of words. She writes the title, Persuasion. She moves her hand from left to right, filling the page with ink. Her physical body undergoes specific biological changes. The adrenal glands resting above her kidneys reduce their output of specific hormones. The muscles in her arms and legs fatigue rapidly. She experiences a persistent ache in her joints. The pigmentation of the skin on her face and hands darkens to a brown shade. She stops moving her hand. She places the wet quill onto the polished wood of the table. She rests her head against the high wooden back of the chair. She closes her eyes. She breathes air into her lungs at a slow, shallow pace. The physical effort required to drag the sharp quill across the paper fibers increases each day. 60 miles to the east, grey cold smoke hangs over the wet cobblestone streets of London. Henry Austen sits in a room on Henrietta Street. He sits at a large mahogany desk. He opens a massive ledger book bound in thick brown leather. He turns the heavy paper pages. He looks at the numbers written in black ink. The numbers represent the physical gold and silver coins held in the vaults of his banking business. The ink dictates a value of 0. The heavy metal coins are gone. Henry picks up a steel-nibbed pen. He dips it in ink. He signs his name at the bottom of multiple flat paper documents. He melts red wax over the paper folds and presses a brass seal into the hot puddles. He hands these documents to other men. These physical papers transfer the legal ownership of vast dirt fields, stone houses, and heavy wooden furniture from the Austen brothers to their creditors. Henry stands up from the mahogany desk. He puts on a heavy wool coat. He walks out of the building. He steps onto the damp cobblestones. He walks through the dense London air, smelling the burning sea coal and raw sewage. He walks to Stationer's Court. He pushes open the heavy wooden door of Benjamin Crosby and Company. The interior of the shop smells of wet black printer's ink, animal hide binding glue, and dry paper dust. Heavy iron printing presses clank loudly in the back rooms. Henry walks to the long oak counter. Benjamin Crosby stands behind the counter. Henry reaches his hand into a cloth pouch. He pulls out 10 gold coins. The metal features the stamped profile of the king. Henry places the 10 coins onto the flat wooden counter. The heavy gold discs click against the hard oak. Crosby picks up the 10 coins. He drops them into a wooden lockbox. He walks to his large wooden desk. He inserts a small brass key into the circular metal keyhole on the front drawer. He turns the key to the right. The iron bolt slides back with a sharp metallic click. He pulls the wooden drawer open. The wood rubs against the tracks. Dust coats the inside of the dark space. Crosby reaches his hands into the drawer. He pulls out a thick stack of rough, handwritten paper. The edges of the paper display a slight yellow discoloration. The black ink on the top page spells the word Susan. The iron gall ink dried completely 13 years prior. Crosby carries the stack of paper to the counter. He hands the heavy manuscript to Henry. Henry takes the physical pages. He carries them out of the shop. Days later, a mail carriage rolls up the dirt road in Chawton. A man hands a brown paper package to the maid. The maid carries the package into the dining parlour and sets it on the walnut table. Jane unties the rough hemp string. She unfolds the brown paper. She looks at the top page. She sees the exact shapes of the letters she formed with her wet feather quill in the Steventon Rectory in 1798. She runs her fingertips over the dry paper. She opens the drawer of her walnut table. She places the thick stack of paper inside the empty space. She pushes the drawer shut. Jane pulls a fresh stack of completely blank paper onto the desk. She picks up a steel knife. She carves a sharp new point onto her goose feather quill. She dips the tip into the glass inkwell. The dark liquid coats the hollow point. She presses the quill against the top sheet of white paper. She writes the title, Sanditon. She writes sentences describing a town built directly next to the ocean. She writes words detailing the salty seawater hitting the wet sand. She describes the physical wooden bathing machines pulled by horses into the cold waves. She fills several pages with wet ink. Her physical movements slow down. The muscles in her right arm ache. Her fingers loosen their grip on the carved feather. She sets the quill down on the table. She leaves the Sanditon manuscript sitting on the polished walnut wood. The calendar turns to May 1817. The temperature of the air rises. Green leaves push out from the branches of the oak trees. Jane stands in her second-floor bedroom. She opens the lid of her heavy leather trunk. She folds her cotton dresses into flat squares. She places them into the bottom of the box. Cassandra folds her own clothes and places them beside Jane's clothes. They pull the thick leather straps through the brass buckles and pull them tight. Two men carry the heavy leather trunk down the narrow wooden stairs. A carriage, drawn by horses, waits on the dirt road outside. Jane walks out the heavy oak front door. She steps onto the metal steps and enters the wooden cabin, taking her seat on the padded leather bench to travel toward the city of Winchester. May 1817, Hampshire. Heavy rain falls from dense grey clouds. The water droplets hit the flat wooden roof of a moving carriage, producing a loud, continuous drumming sound. The iron rims of the tall wooden wheels cut deep tracks through the wet dirt of the road. Thick brown mud splashes against the painted wooden side panels of the cabin. The horses breathe heavily, pulling the carriage forward. Inside the cabin, the air temperature is low. The enclosed space smells of damp wool cloaks, wet horsehair, and wet leather. Jane sits on the padded leather bench. Her physical mass is significantly lower than in previous years. Her skin displays a dark brown pigmentation. The cartilage in her joints aches with the continuous, jarring movements of the carriage over the uneven ground. Cassandra sits directly beside her on the bench. Cassandra extends her arm and places her palm over Jane's hand. The skin of their hands touches. The horses pull the carriage onto the paved stone streets of the city of Winchester. The driver pulls the thick leather reins. The carriage stops completely in front of a narrow brick house on College Street. A large bay window projects outward from the front wall of the building. Two men step to the carriage door. They lift Jane out of the cabin. They carry her physical body through the wooden front door of the house. They walk up a narrow wooden staircase. They carry her into a second-floor room. They place her flat onto a thick feather mattress resting on a wooden bed frame. The room contains a brick fireplace, 2 straight-backed wooden chairs, and a small table. Jane rests her head against a white linen pillow. A man named Giles King Lyford walks into the room. He wears a dark, tailored wool coat. He works as a medical doctor. He steps to the side of the wooden bed. He places the flat pads of his index and middle fingers directly against the skin of Jane's left wrist. He feels the physical pulsing of blood moving through her radial artery. He pulls a brass pocket watch from his coat. He watches the metal second hand tick in a circle, counting the exact number of heartbeats per minute. He looks at the dark brown pigmentation covering the skin of her face and hands. Inside Jane's body, specific cellular structures fail. Modern medical historians identify these physical symptoms as the biological indicators of Addison's disease, or Hodgkin's lymphoma. The adrenal glands, resting directly above her kidneys, stop producing the hormones cortisol and aldosterone. The dropping sodium levels in her bloodstream cause severe muscle fatigue. The pituitary gland in her brain produces excess adrenocorticotropic hormone. This chemical travels through her blood and stimulates the melanocytes in her skin to produce large quantities of dark melanin pigment, changing the exact color of her flesh. Jane remains flat on the mattress. She breathes the air in the room. She reaches her hand out toward the small wooden table beside the bed. She picks up a thin wooden cylinder containing a core of solid black graphite. She picks up a flat sheet of white paper. She holds the paper against the hard surface of a wooden writing board resting on her lap. She presses the tip of the graphite stick against the dry paper fibers. She moves her fingers. The physical friction rubs the graphite off the stick, leaving dark gray marks on the white paper. She writes a sequence of rhyming words. She writes a comic poem about the residents of Winchester and a local historical figure named Saint Swithin. She stops moving the pencil. She opens her mouth. She vibrates her vocal cords. She reads the comic verses out loud to Cassandra. She raises the corners of her mouth and exposes her white teeth, smiling. Cassandra listens to the spoken words. Cassandra produces a short vocalization of laughter. The sound of her laughter mixes with the popping of the black coal burning in the iron grate. The calendar pages turn. The month of July arrives. The summer heat warms the exterior brick walls of the house on College Street. The glass window remains open. Warm air blows into the bedroom. July 18th, 1817. Jane lies perfectly still on the bed. Cassandra sits on a wooden chair directly beside the mattress. She holds Jane's hand. Jane breathes air into her lungs. The volume of air entering her chest decreases with each breath. The interval of time between each breath lengthens. Jane inhales a final volume of air. She exhales the air. Her chest falls. The muscles in her heart cease their rhythmic contractions. The blood stops moving through her arteries and veins. The electrical signals in her brain stop firing. Her physical body becomes entirely still. Cassandra sits in the chair. She looks at the physical body resting on the mattress. The brass clock on the mantelpiece continues to tick. The small metal gears rotate continuously inside the glass case. The sun moves slowly across the sky outside the window. 4 days later, men arrive at the house on College Street. They carry a large rectangular box constructed entirely of solid oak planks. They lift Jane's body and place it inside the wooden box. They secure a flat oak lid over the top. They lift the heavy box. They carry it down the wooden staircase. They walk out the front door and step onto the stone pavement. They carry the wooden box down the street. They walk toward the massive stone structure of Winchester Cathedral. The cathedral features towering limestone walls, heavy lead roofs, and tall glass windows. The men carry the oak box through the large arched wooden doorway. The interior of the cathedral is vast. Tall stone columns rise to support the vaulted stone ceiling. The air inside the building smells of coal dust, damp limestone, and old beeswax candles. The ambient temperature drops sharply away from the summer sun. The hard leather soles of the men's shoes strike the stone floor, sending loud echoes bouncing off the high plaster walls. The men carry the box into the north aisle of the cathedral. On the floor, a large, rectangular slab of black ledger stone is missing. Men with iron shovels previously removed the stone and dug a deep hole in the compacted dirt directly beneath the cathedral floor. The smell of wet earth rises from the open hole. The men attach thick hemp ropes to the brass handles of the oak box. They lower the wooden box down into the deep hole. The wood scrapes against the loose dirt. The box rests flat on the bottom of the hole. The men use their iron shovels to push the loose dirt back into the hole. The heavy soil falls onto the oak lid, creating dull, thudding sounds. They fill the hole completely to the level of the surrounding floor. They lift the heavy slab of black stone. They place the stone perfectly flat over the filled hole. The edges of the black stone align flush with the adjacent grey flagstones. The physical body of Jane Austen rests beneath the heavy stone, sealed entirely from the light of the sun and the movement of the air above. Late December, 1817, Albemarle Street, London. Thick white snowflakes fall through the cold winter air. The frozen water crystals land on the wet cobblestone streets and melt rapidly into grey slush. The air above the street smells of burning sea coal and wet horsehair. Inside John Murray's publishing shop, the ambient air holds a higher temperature. The heavy smell of boiling pine resin, black lampblack soot, and dried animal hide glue fills the enclosed space. Men stand in the back room of the shop. They push heavy iron levers attached to large wooden printing presses. Flat wooden boards press damp, rough-edged linen paper against raised lead blocks. The metal blocks are coated in a thick layer of wet black ink. The men pull the iron levers back. They lift the damp paper. Sharp black letters cover the white surface. The men fold the printed sheets. They push steel needles carrying heavy linen thread through the folds, binding the pages together. They glue stiff cardboard to the outsides of the folded paper. They wrap the cardboard in plain brown paper. They create a matched 4-volume set. 2 volumes contain the text of Northanger Abbey. 2 volumes contain the text of Persuasion. In a separate room, Henry Austen sits at a wooden desk. He holds a carved goose feather quill. He dips the tip into a glass bottle of dark black ink. He presses the wet point against a sheet of white paper. He writes a sequence of words detailing the physical life of his sister. He moves his hand, dragging the sharp quill across the paper fibers. He forms the letters J-A-N-E-A-U-S-T-E-N. He writes her legal name in wet ink on the paper. The men in the back room arrange small lead blocks to match Henry's handwritten letters. They press the inked metal into the paper. The black ink spells Jane Austen's name at the very beginning of the bound volumes. The printed letters explicitly identify the specific human being who produced the original handwritten manuscripts. Customers walk through the heavy wooden door of John Murray's shop. They wear thick wool coats and leather gloves. They step up to the flat oak counter. They open cloth purses and place heavy silver shillings onto the polished wood. The metal clinks against the oak. The customers pick up the 4-volume sets. They carry the physical books out into the cold London air. The books travel in horse-drawn carriages over dirt turnpikes. People place the volumes on flat wooden shelves inside brick houses and stone estates. Over the next 50 consecutive years, the paper books rest on these shelves. Grey dust particles settle on the top edges of the paper pages. A small, steady number of people exchange physical currency for the books in London shops. They sit in upholstered chairs, open the covers, and look at the black ink. The calendar pages turn. The year changes to 1869. A man named James Edward Austen Lee sits at a wooden desk. He is the biological son of Jane's brother, James. He dips a steel-nibbed pen into a glass inkwell. He presses the wet metal against flat sheets of paper. He writes a sequence of words detailing specific events from Jane Austen's life. He compiles a physical manuscript titled A Memoir of Jane Austen. He carries the stack of paper to a printer. Men arrange lead blocks and press ink onto paper. They bind the pages into books covered in dark cloth. Customers exchange metal coins for this new book. They open the covers and read the printed words describing the woman who wrote at the small walnut table in Chawton. The physical reproduction of Jane Austen's original handwritten words increases rapidly following the publication of the memoir. Men build massive printing presses powered by steam engines. The heavy iron gears rotate continuously. The presses push black ink into long, continuous rolls of white paper at high speeds. Workers cut the paper, apply hot glue, and attach thick cardboard covers wrapped in colored cloth. They pack thousands of these physical objects into wooden crates. Men load the wooden crates onto trains. The trains burn black coal, boiling water, into steam. The steam pushes heavy iron pistons, turning steel wheels along iron tracks. The trains deliver the books to large port cities. Men load the crates deep into the wooden hulls of massive ships. The ships cross the saltwater oceans. They carry the printed volumes to cities on different continents. The physical production continues for decades. The printing technology shifts from steam to electricity. Metal presses continue to apply ink to paper. Factories produce millions of identical copies of the 6 completed novels. People in locations across the globe hold these physical objects in their hands. They turn the paper pages. They read the exact sequences of words Jane Austen wrote with her wet feather quill inside the Steventon Rectory and the Chawton Cottage. The printed ink describes the characters sitting in wooden chairs, drinking hot tea from porcelain cups, walking across muddy fields, and speaking exact sequences of words to one another. The arrangement of these words establishes a structural pattern for the construction of prose narratives. Other humans sit at their own wooden desks. They dip their own quills, press steel pens, or push plastic typewriter keys. They arrange their words in direct response to the specific structural pattern Jane Austen created on her rough linen paper. In the city of Winchester, the massive limestone walls of the cathedral stand completely intact. The heavy lead roof blocks the rain. Tall glass windows let yellow sunlight into the vast interior space. Visitors walk through the large arched wooden doors. The air inside the building smells of cold stone, damp earth, and old beeswax. The visitors step onto the grey stone floor of the north aisle. The hard leather and rubber soles of their shoes strike the stone, sending short, sharp echoes bouncing off the high plaster walls. They stop walking. They look down at a large, rectangular slab of black ledger stone resting perfectly flush with the surrounding floorboards. A stonemason previously used an iron chisel and a heavy metal mallet to carve deep grooves into the flat black surface. The carved grooves form straight lines and uniform letters. The visitors point their eyes at the carved letters. They read the sequence of words cut into the stone. The letters spell the name Jane Austen. The visitors stand in the cold air of the cathedral. They breathe air into their lungs. They stand directly over the compacted earth containing the solid oak box. They observe the physical marks cut into the stone, marking the exact location of the woman who watched the physical movements of the people around her and pressed those movements into black